My career goes back 30 years.
Mhm.
When I first began, we administered what was called the CAT, the California Aptitude Test, or the ITBS, Iowa Test of Basic Skills. And there was no preparation for it. It was basically an aptitude test, and the only measurement was student growth from one year to the next year. In other words, was there the measurement was of intellectual growth appropriate to a year's worth of growing.
Mhm.
And so that was this total sum of standardized testing that existed here in Texas when I first began. About 2 years into my teaching career, they began subject-specific areas, or more subject-specific areas, developed here for Texas, called teams. And then they went through TOS and a number of others. They have progressively become more difficult, but the big leap was from TAX to STAR. That is a significant leap in rigor with regard to the test. I've been an AP grader, reader for a long, long time, and I've been involved in the development of standardized testing for College Board and the like, and for the state of Texas. And I can tell you that what's different about STAR, first of all, is that we don't know what it looks like. The questions, we only have a handful of questions that have been released, so there's very little information. The other key aspect is that the questions that have been released are much more content-driven and much more rigorous in that content than the previous TAX test, which more was an interpretation and skills test. So in other words, your background content knowledge was not being tested. Your skills were being tested. STAR is testing content background knowledge primarily, and that's a total different ballgame. And having seen and developed the Texas exam, the exit exam for teachers, which is based on the Texas TEKS, and having been part of development of AP questions as well as TAX questions, this is more like AP Light. I would argue that perhaps the language is a little bit lower grade level, but not significantly. It's probably on grade level with regard to the wording of the question. Definitely academic vocabulary from the content is there, much more so than in the past. And I would also argue that it's basically AP multiple choice questions with 4 selections instead of 5 selections. So that's a big change.
Definitely.
And the idea that there are 15 tests, although now the legislature has reduced it back down to 5, that was a significant change as well. Right.
How were you held accountable at that time for your students' growth?
As a teacher, we were observed by our principals, and we were also evaluated, I'll be honest, on your passing rate, your students' passing rate. And the standardized test was not the measure of the teacher performance, but was based on observations of the teacher and the teacher's grade book and the performance of the students in that grade book. So that was primarily how the evaluations took place.
So on one level, we don't have the same kind of accountability as a standardized test, or the kind that students take today in schools. But there's an expectation that if your child has 4 years of Spanish and takes AP Spanish, they'd better make a pretty good grade on that test. And AP teachers are definitely judged on how well students do on the tests. And the program is judged on how well students are doing on that particular test. But if it's a lower level Spanish and students are only taking 2 years, there's very little program accountability. And it's because it's an elective. And as an elective, It does not have the high profile that English and math and your sciences have, even though it's an extremely important area of curriculum. It's an elective, and because of that, it doesn't get a lot of support and funding in most schools in Texas.
The test was always well below what I was teaching. I'm talking about on grade level classes. I taught collab classes. I taught the troubled kids, but I also taught advanced kids. So you develop specializations or expertise by trial.
Okay.
You know that already.
Yeah.
Well, I taught both levels, both ends, and the test was below the level of what I was teaching. So I never worried about it. The only time I paid attention to the test itself was I would give them like a day or two review, because the content at 10th grade level reviewed 8th grade material. And so I would do a quick reminder, playing some games of the primary 8th grade content. And then I would give them a couple practice multiple choice.
And so that's what you're talking about. The big difference between STAR and the other tests was that the other tests were a little bit below grade level, and this is
Yes.
on or maybe higher.
Yeah, I would also argue that the TAKS measured skills.
Okay.
In other words, here's a chart, interpret this chart.
Okay.
Here's a map, interpret this map. More so than which individual played the greatest contribution to the decline of labor, of the labor movement in the 50s. That's a much different question. Social studies has always been the stepchild. Are you talking about testing here specifically?
Yeah, with testing.
Okay, I can tell you that. Let me answer it this way. The first social studies testing was in TAKS, and our scores were always extremely high, because I think students can relate more to the content, but also I just think it was an easier test. And so we caught a lot of flack because they said our test was too easy. So we were somewhat disregarded in that. We fought, as a department head and member of the curriculum leadership in the state, we always fought for an essay to be included in the social studies evaluation piece content. And we actually did a pilot for one in 8th grade for about 2 years back in the 90s. And it was extremely effective, but it was too expensive for them to grade, and so they never implemented it as part of the TAKS test. But I would argue that would be a more legitimate evaluation than the multiple choice pieces that are being utilized now. So this is the other part that you have to understand for social studies. The 10th grade test didn't count for anything. So students frequently didn't put much into it. Also, that 10th grade test was 30% 8th grade material, which is not part of the 10th grade curriculum. So you had to stop and go and review that 8th grade content. And the majority of the questions they missed were from that 8th grade content. And so the state received a great deal of criticism for the TAKS test in social studies in 10th grade because it didn't cover the curriculum and it didn't count. Only the exit test at 11th grade counted. The 10th grade test was just for nothing. Mm-hmm. And so the students didn't put as much effort. You had to artificially build up, participation. So we criticized the state for that. In exchange, the STAR test now, the poorest scores are in social studies. So,
and why do you think that is?
Because I think they ramped up the level of question to a much higher level. Like I said, AP Light and the world history curriculum. I mean, you have to teach the entire history of the world from beginning to end. Yeah. I mean, it's daunting content, if you really think about it. And I think the criticism was, okay, you didn't like our 8th grade review, here you go. And again, I'm not a conspiracy theorist or anything like that, but I know that they were not happy with the criticism that they received. So I think they were trying to play gotcha with teachers with the high stakes testing, when in reality the issue was quality of teacher and being able to extend the rigor, to extend the rigor of the content or, in other words, to up the level of teaching. Unfortunately, that is not solved by a multiple choice test with specific names and individuals and battles and terms. In social studies, one must understand, to really do historical thinking, you have to understand context, you have to have a great deal of understanding of current events, you have to make connections between the past and today, compare and contrast, change over time. Those are the types of skills necessary for social studies to be done well, and for historical thinking and constructivist thinking to be done well. Unfortunately, what the multiple choice test does is it targets you specifically to these factual pieces of content. And teachers are too worried about hitting all of those pieces of content rather than having faith in good teaching that by manipulating and doing those historical thinking pieces, the content will be absorbed in the process. So instead of trusting teaching as that intellectual process, they're worried about making sure they hit each of those little points. And when you worry about hitting each of those little points, it's meaningless learning.
From my perception of standardized tests of any sort, are that students who may have a lot of ability and a lot of content knowledge are not necessarily put into an environment where they can really show what they know. I think standardized tests do not necessarily reflect what teachers teach, the good stuff that teachers teach. And I think that teachers that end up teaching to a test do a great disservice to students. It stifles a lot of what is important about our educational system. The one thing that everybody in the world recognizes about our young people is that they are creative, that they're innovative. Standardized testing does not help students develop the creative thinking skills, the critical thinking skills, the innovative thinking skills that we need in our students for the future. And I would like to see a little bit less of the standardized testing, a little less of the onus on the shoulders of teachers to have to teach. Here's how you take a multiple choice test. Here's what you should be looking for. Oh, that's right. Here's the vocabulary I know that's going to be on this test. It's just not the way that we should be teaching. And it certainly does not support the kind of learning that we ought to be seeing in our schools today.